Welcome back. So when I was on the Analog Talk podcast a couple of months ago, one of the questions that they always ask is, what's your favorite camera? And I have a hard time answering that one because over the years, as anyone who has kept up with me will know, I have switched out lots and lots of different cameras over that course of time. But the one that's really stuck with me, even though they're like the Pentax 67 II series, I've gone back to that 3 times now, 4 if you count a 6x7. But the camera that's really stuck with me, and I've had it now for over 7 years, is the Leica M6. And the Leica M6 is really, as far as I can tell, just by watching the internet talk, kind of the current go-to in terms of my first Leica, my first M-mount Leica anyway. And I think there are a few reasons for that. Number one being that it has a light meter, which, as modern photography goes, is seen often as a necessity. Unlike large format where the light meter is kind of expected you to carry with it, when you get down to the smaller formats like the 35, you really need it built in, because next thing you know, you're carrying around a camera that's this big and a light meter that's about the same size, and all of a sudden your pack weight doubles. So having the light meter built in, having it take modern batteries, unlike the M5, which also has a light meter built in but takes a different one of those 1.35 volts. It has a modern flash and modern flash PC sync on the back, which again is little conveniences that really make the experience more up to date and more in line with what a lot of photographers are used to these days. Contains all 6 viewfinders, or excuse me, 3 different viewing modes in the rangefinder itself, providing 6 different frame lines from 28 all the way up to 135. And just like with any Leica, those obviously can be modified. If you do send it off, you can have certain ones masked. If you find yourself really only ever shooting 28 but never the 90, you can have the 90 get taken away and have a much clearer viewfinder. The camera itself, though, does have some differences between a lot of other Leicas. It was released in the late 80s, I believe 1987, really after the flop that was the Leica M5. The CL obviously came into play, but was then quickly pulled. The rumor has it that it was removed from the market because it was outselling the M5, and Leica couldn't have a Minolta camera selling better than their own version. So the M5 chugged along, and then they brought out the M4 II, which was essentially the M4, but with the 6 frame lines that you'll find in this camera as well. They then modified that using some of what they had learned from the M5 and the CL to include the light meter, but in a much more traditional format. So as you can see, it's essentially the Leica M4 body. In doing so, though, they changed to a zinc top plate for all M6 models. So you'll never, no matter if you get the black chrome, which is what I have here, or the silver version, you'll never have that nice brassing. You can kind of see right here by the strap lug. I don't know if the camera will focus, but there it is. That's the look you'll get underneath this camera as time goes on. It's none of that really beautiful brassing. It's a much more traditional camera wear and tear. Leica also did modify the frame advance, which you can see here. So the M4 frame advance is just quite a bit bulkier. This one's a little bit more streamlined, but does have the dual action that you'll find on the M4, as well as all future Leica models, with the exception of like the MP and the MA. There are 2 versions of there's quite a few versions of the M6. Like with all Leica cameras, they changed a whole bunch of small things over time. But a few things that did change between the 2 primary Leica M6 models, which you have the original Leica M6, which I have here. Then you have the Leica M6 TTL. And the TTL was just a little bit different in that it took this modern hot shoe mount and added TTL metering so that you could have more advanced flash programs with it. In doing so, the top plate, which is this guy right here, got about 2 millimeters taller. They also changed the shutter speed dial. Now, the reason why changing the shutter speed dial is important, as you can see here, is that when we On all Leica cameras, this is how it worked. You would push it to the right with your finger. I know it's kind of going to the left in the screen, but to the right with your finger, and that would drop the shutter speed. And then if you pulled it, it would increase the shutter speed, which is completely fine, except for when you look through the light meter, you're doing the inverse of what the light meter is showing you. And what I mean by that is the light meter uses 2 arrows, and we'll see if we can pull this up here. There it is. So you can see one arrow there that I'm looking through. And as we adjust this, let's see if I can get to go the right way. There we go. So that's a correct exposure when both are lit up. And then you would have underexposed and overexposed. Now, the nice thing about the arrows is that they point in the direction that you need to adjust the aperture. So when the arrow is pointing that way, which is to the left, I'm trying to do all this backwards, so it's a little bit tricky, but to the left, you just move the aperture in the same direction and everything lines up. However, as I was mentioning with the shutter speed dial, it's the opposite. So you have to push it into the arrow to get it to work right. And so when I went to the M6 TTL, they changed that. You got the bigger shutter speed dial, which goes to the edge of the camera. And I'll be honest, I've used it, and it does make it much nicer for changing the shutter speed, because you can do it right here. It's a more ergonomic feature. You have a lot more heft to the shutter speed dial, and everything kind of syncs up with how the light meter works. So just in terms of overall function, it's a much more user-friendly experience. You will pay a little bit more for that, though, funny enough, not too much. The difference between a M6 Classic and the M6 TTL in terms of price really isn't that much. Maybe $100 or $2. Obviously, that depends on condition and all sorts of things, but pretty consistently, the M6 has hovered, regardless of which version you're looking at, in the $1,200 to $1,600 range. And that's for body only, by the way. You can tell a lot about the camera by its markings as well. So as you can see on the front here, mine says Leica M6. Rare, or not necessarily rare, but harder to find versions will only have M6 right here. It's much more in the line of the M7, the M8. The readings like this, where it says Leica M6, is far more traditional. And I believe that the M6 only markings were some of the earliest versions. Certain models will also have font up here, writings that say Leica camera, and then Germany, whereas most of them, again, will have it on the back like mine does. Now, while we're on the back, you do have the very traditional Leica ISO setting. The only difference here is that you're not just changing it to remind you what you have in the camera. This is actually how the light meter changes. There are contacts in the back of this film pressure plate that communicate, or that correspond this in terms of resistance with the built-in light meter. And the way the light meter works is actually relatively simple, and it's a much more durable method than the M5 or the CL. Both the M5 and the CL used a mechanical system to bring the silver dot into play, whereas this, it's printed onto the shutter curtain as well. And the nice thing about this is that if it does wear down over time, it can always be reapplied. Now, basically what you have is this neutral gray, or was it 18% gray? I can never remember. It's neutral gray painted on the curtain here, and then up inside of the camera itself is where you'll find the light meter, and the light meter is pointing onto this, which is reading the light that's being thrown onto it by the camera itself. And so as you cock the shutter, it advances that, brings it into plane, and will allow you to use the light meter. If the shutter is uncocked, the whole light meter system is off, which can also save you battery. There have been plenty of times where I've left my camera cocked, thrown it into my camera bag, especially if you have a soft trigger release and it gets bumped continuously, that battery will drain. Though normally it'll last you a really long time as long as you're good about keeping the light meter turned off, which unfortunately I am not. Some other things you want to look out for with these cameras, though, if you are looking to buy one, is that because they have the zinc alloy top plate and bottom plate as well, they can get this certain versions can get this weird corrosion underneath. It doesn't necessarily impact the function of the camera. It's just ugly. It looks like a gross rash. All typical Leica accessories are compatible with this camera, so there's assortments of grips, half cases. As long as it fits a Leica film camera, a Leica M body film camera, you can pretty much be guaranteed that it'll work with this. It'll work with any number of Leica flashes, but actually my preferred flash is the Vivitar 125. It's an incredibly simple, incredibly lightweight, and incredibly cheap flash. Both of mine have been purchased for a couple of bucks a piece, and they work great. And because there's no special contacts in the hot shoe, it doesn't matter what you use. If you have a M6 DTL, it may be worth investing in one of the Leica flashes so that you can get that functionality. The last thing that I want to touch on is going back to the viewfinder and rangefinder here. The M6 is prone to flaring, and what that means is when you are looking through the camera and you get to certain angles, the sun can really wash out your rangefinder patch, making it hard to focus. You can upgrade this to a non-flare finder over here on this side, but it'll cost you about $500-600. So if you're shopping for a camera and you see one that has that upgrade for a lower price, that's something you might want to consider. Lastly, they came in 3 different viewfinder magnifications. So I have the 0.72, which is the most common, most traditional, and typically seen as the best for 35mm. You have the 0.85, which is higher magnification. You lose the 28mm frame lines, but you do get a better field of view if you're a 50mm shooter. It's also seen as the primary, then you have the 0.58, which is the primary one for those with glasses. So it's a much wider viewfinder, but if you do wear glasses, it makes it much easier to see what's going on in the viewfinder. From what I understand, people who wear glasses, when they use the 28, it basically goes away, and when they use the 35mm, it's on the extreme edges of their field of view. So anyway, that's the Leica M6. Brief overview. I kind of had to rush through it, but this has been one of my favorite cameras to use, and I don't think I'll ever get rid of it. If you enjoyed watching me, and as I hope you do, please be sure to subscribe to this channel. Would really love to hit 1,000 subscribers. Please also be sure to follow me on social media. I'll include all the links below here. And tune in next time as I go into more detail with other cameras.